Hey everyone, I'm Kelvin. This is Josiah, and you're watching Cloud and Fire. We have an awesome episode. We have brought back Eli Ayala, who is kind of like, we like kind of fanboy out to him, to be honest with you. But we had questions concerning the last episode that we did with him. And I emailed Eli and I was like, hey, listen, I really don't want to answer for you. I thought most of them I could because they weren't always the sharpest of questions, but I thought it would be better just to bring the man, the myth, and the legend back on. So Eli, welcome back to Cloud and Fire. Thank you so much for coming on. And how are you doing, brother?
The man, the myth, and the legend. I've never been introduced like that before.
I'm telling you, man, I'm kind of like your biggest sponsor right now because I just feel like there's a space empty in the world of presuppositional apologetics. And to be honest with you, like even one of the guys that I've been talking to, who is not a proponent of and very much against the presuppositional and transcendental argument for God, respects you and has said very kind things about you. So I am doing pretty much all I can to get your name out as a good proponent of and promote you. So with that being said, though, are you ready? Are you ready to deal with these intense questions that we have for you?
Well, let's. I'll be the judge of that, right? We'll see.
So let's talk about science for a moment, right?
Okay.
One commentator claimed that science doesn't assume order because that was something that was stated, I think, in the video. So it says it's quite the opposite. It describes the chaotic world, and it's able to do that without using the magic of God. So how would you talk to someone who is addressing the topic of God and science and how basically trying to give science the upper hand and stating that science doesn't assume anything, but us Christians or those who have the Christian worldview do? How would you address that?
Oh, I'll be perfectly honest. That's a very silly and very philosophically naive position to hold. When someone says science just describes, description itself presupposes order. I mean, you need the laws of logic. The laws of logic are laws, which assume order and structure, right? Science as a methodology for investigating the natural world presupposes logic. It presupposes the uniformity of nature. If nature was not uniform and generally predictable, then you couldn't do science. So if someone's going to start with science, that makes no sense because science as a methodology has what we call necessary preconditions. There are things that must be true about the nature of the world first before something like science can even be done. So it's kind of a very naive perspective to just say, well, science doesn't assume any of that. It just describes. And then that language of just describe already gives away the hand, right?
Yeah.
To describe something is to already presuppose categories of order. Now, if you want to read the comment again, there were a couple of things that stood out to me. I don't want to miss them. So if you could repeat it.
Yeah. So basically the concept is that science doesn't assume order. In other words, it's trying to say that it observes order and then makes a claim about it. I think that's how I would describe what the person's saying. It says it's quite the opposite. It describes the chaotic world and is able to do that without using magic, because I think they're trying to ascribe that, basically saying that God is the answer to it isn't really an answer, doesn't solve anything. And it actually connects to another question, and I'll let you do them both because I think they're connected. I don't want to make you do it later. But it says that, so the idea was that how do you respond to what some call a simpler model that concerning the laws of logic, that they're just simply descriptive principles of how reality naturally operates, right? And that kind of connects, I think, to the last one. It's basically saying that if we just say that God did it, do we actually solve anything in this matter?
Yeah. Well, the God did it language seems to suggest that the argument that we're giving is kind of a God of the gaps argument. And if that's the assumption and the assertion, then it's just a misunderstanding of the nature of a transcendental argument. A transcendental argument is not plugging in God in something we don't know. A transcendental argument argues pretty much that, if I can put it in logical structure, X is the necessary precondition for Y, therefore X. So we're asserting something that everyone acknowledges, and then we ask, what are the preconditions that need to be present in order for that thing to be possible? So you're not plugging in God in an area of ignorance. We're actually arguing that unless you start with the God of Christianity, the Christian worldview, you don't have the preconditions necessary for the intelligibility of whatever intelligible thing we're asserting. So that's one thing. You can repeat the question again. So, okay, description. I remember you said so. Yeah. So this is common. First of all, asserting something doesn't make it so. If you say, well, logic is just description, that's an assertion. Okay. And the idea that logic is merely descriptive, it undercuts its own perspective and actually undercuts the necessary preconditions for knowledge and intelligible experience. If logic is mere description, then it is not prescriptive, and therefore it's not universal in its application. But if logic is not universal in its application, then what obligates me for agreeing with any logical conclusions you draw? If logic isn't universal, then I can operate on different laws of logic, contradict you, and you can't say that I'm wrong. That's what happens when you make logic mere description. It loses its universal application. And if logic is not universal, then that undercuts the preconditions of intelligibility.
Can I jump in there? Can you explain that a little more for someone who's maybe more introductory? You're saying that the difference between prescriptive and descriptive, if someone is describing something that they experience, how does that not make it universal? And I know that may sound overly simplistic to you, but just for the comment.
That's not simplistic.
Yeah.
So if logic is mere description, if logic is just, I'll put it this way, as one atheist put it, if logic is merely linguistics, like words we use to describe the consistency of reality, okay, you run into a couple of problems. If it's mere description, then it's not normative. You're just describing something. That's it. And that description may be inconsistent or consistent, whatever. If it's just describing something, then it's not universal. You're just describing something. It doesn't give us normative obligation to reason, consistently in that fashion. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
You run into another problem too, that if logic is merely the linguistic description of the consistency of reality, we then have the issue of the uniformity of nature. Why is reality consistent? And of course, the unbeliever has no basis for that. He's just going to say, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way we describe it. Okay, well, that's arbitrary. If you're allowed to reason on that basis, then that undercuts the preconditions of rational argumentation. Because if someone could assert an arbitrary position, then the other person can assert an arbitrary position, and you won't get anywhere. Now, so
that's a really good point. But I've experienced this, and there's the difference between dealing, as you well know, dealing with people online and the varying degrees of background in this topic, right? Mm-hmm. The average person would say, well, why do we have to know? Why do we have to ground these transcendental? Why do we have to do these things? Why do we have to know these? That was actually one of the statements that someone made. And then you have the other person who has the philosophical background going, yeah, I know we have to do that, and then may argue from a different perspective. How do you explain it to the person who goes, hey, why don't you just enjoy life? Why does this matter? Why do you have to know this?
If someone wants to exist in blissful ignorance, then sure, fine, quote unquote, you don't have to know this. But if you're going to engage in the reason-giving game in terms of giving any explanation of anything whatsoever, yeah, you're going to have to give a justification for the things that you assert. If you don't want to argue or reason with anyone, you can pretend those questions are not important and you can go on with your merry life, right? But even when you go on with your merry life, you can't live in a world never giving justification and reason for the things that you're doing. Yeah. Because reasons and justifications not only are things that we give as individuals, we actually rely on other people giving us reasons and justifications because they determine in a lot of cases how we act and how we respond and whether we're going to do one thing or the other. So people can pretend that it's not important, or if people don't want to do the hard philosophical work and actually give reasons for their foundations, sure, if you want to be arbitrary, that's fine. Just you can't engage in the reason-giving game. Don't say Christians are irrational or this person's irrational, because then again, you're going to have to then justify your foundations. You don't get to just say it doesn't matter and wave your hand and make the problems go away.
I think that's
if ignorance is bliss, then sure.
I think that's an important point that you made, because I think part of even using presuppositional as an evangelistic tool is to point out those things, to say, hey, have you ever thought about why do you do this or not do that, right? And you're trying to draw them into understanding, hey, you're doing this, but why? And that right. I think goes into the grounding. So did you have something going?
All you can do is hopefully help someone see why it's important to know these things. But you can't obviously ultimately you can't force someone to agree that they're important. And in that case, you're not doing apologetics. I mean, you can pray for the person, pray for opportunities, open heart, those sorts of things. But if someone just doesn't want to reason with you or whatever, I mean, okay, you're not doing apologetics at that point.
I think they say, dust the or brush the dust off your feet and go on to the next town. But go ahead, Josiah.
Wait, so you're saying if you want to be happy, don't be a philosopher? Is that what you're saying?
Well, in a sense, in a very colloquial sense, that's probably true. The more you think about deep issues of reality and realize that they're very difficult to answer, these questions will keep you up at night. So, in a sense, you're not doing philosophy.
Even the Bible says, "He who gains in wisdom gains in misery." I believe it is. So, yeah, go ahead.
So, a lot of people have used the language. Presuppositionalists have used the language of you're borrowing our presuppositions when you're arguing. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? Is that language you use?
Yeah, I think it's important because what we're doing is we're kind of egging the unbeliever on in a way, right? It's like, well, if you think you're not borrowing, then justify the thing you're using and assuming within your own worldview, right?
Yeah.
They can't, and many times they won't, or they'll think that they don't have to, and then they'll continue to use those things as they reason against the Christian worldview. See, so I would argue that the Christian worldview does in fact provide the necessary preconditions for knowledge and intelligible experience. We have a metaphysical grounding for knowledge, logic, science, the uniformity that science presupposes, all these sorts of things. And we could hash those details out. But when we ask the unbeliever to give an account for those things, they often don't. Or if they do, it's an insufficient account that reduces to arbitrariness and inconsistency. Again, someone could say, well, that's all stupid stuff and that's problems in philosophy. Nobody can answer those. But saying that doesn't make the problem go away. Us Christians are able to kind of lay out how a Christian worldview can make sense out of those things. We just hope that unbelievers who engage in this kind of discourse would be willing to give a rational foundation, the very thing that they claim we don't do when we make our assertions and we offer argumentation.
All right. So I want to go to this big question now. The impossibility of the contrary. The last time we talked about it just a little bit, but I don't think we got into it deep. I'd really like to press hard on this for a second, though, because I've had somebody that I've been engaging with who's kind of pressing it.
Sure.
The idea is that, as stated by Bahnsen, is basically Christianity is reasonable in virtue of the impossibility of the contrary.
No, I would, if I can correct.
Yeah.
Christianity is true in virtue of the impossibility of the contrary. I wouldn't just say merely reasonable.
So I have the shirt that said reasonable, so I would have to check his actual quote because I had questioned that as well. Are you saying that Bahnsen stated it that way, or is that how you?
I don't know where you're getting that quotation. I'd have to look at where you got it from. But the idea is that Christianity is true by the impossibility of the contrary. We're not saying, Van Til said this. He says that we're not saying that Christianity is the most reasonable position, but rather it's the only position that can save reason. Bahnsen and Van Til would say that Christianity is reasonable, but we don't say it's reasonable. I mean, I've never heard the phrase reasonable by the impossibility of the contrary. I would say that Christianity is true by the impossibility of the contrary, or the proof of Christianity is that without Christianity, you can't prove anything or anything like that.
So basically it's stating, though, that there's no other possible scenario that could fulfill all of the necessary requirements for us to ground logic and reason. Did I say that right? Or would you kind of adjust that?
Sure. I would. That's fine. I mean, it could always tweak things here and there, but I think you.
Because I'm pressing you on it. So you go ahead and restate it for me then.
Okay. So I would say that Christianity is true by the impossibility of the contrary. That is to say that if something is intelligible, if anything's intelligible, Christianity has to be true, since the Christian worldview provides the metaphysical and epistemological situation that makes anything intelligible. Right. So we talk often of preconditions, like there are preconditions for the fact that we are doing a podcast right now, right? There's certain things that must be true first. We can go back, we can say that the technology needs to be working. That's a necessary precondition. Or you can go back philosophically, the laws of logic need to be universally binding in order for us to meaningfully interact with each other. We need to exist. That's a necessary precondition for doing this, right? So we're saying that what's true of any intelligible thing is that the Christian worldview and what it teaches about the nature of reality must obtain in order for any individual thing or a collection of things to make sense. And that's just to say that the Christian worldview being true is the necessary precondition for intelligible experience.
All right. So how do you give evidence for it? Because the person who was questioning me was saying the difference between the impossibility of the contrary and the improbability of the contrary are two very different things.
Actually, the transcendental argument does not require an inductive disproof of every option. That's number one, and I'll talk about why that's the case in just a moment. Van Til, I think, correctly reduced all worldviews down to two, because all non-Christian worldviews fit in the same bucket in that they all reject the Christian worldview. And that's why Van Til said, ultimately, there's only two worldviews, the Christian worldview and the non-Christian worldview. Think of any worldview that's not the Christian worldview, it's going to fit in the bucket of the non-Christian worldview. And all of them fail because they all have the same deficiency, namely a rejection of the Christian worldview, which provides the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. Now, contrary worldviews can disagree with that, and that's why we debate, right?
Okay.
Someone says, well, wait a second, I'm an atheist and I have the preconditions. Okay, let's talk about how atheism has the preconditions of knowledge. And you get all sorts of things like, logic is not universal, it's descriptive, or logic is a function of the brain. And they think these answers are coherent when in fact they actually undercut the laws of logic and intelligible experience. You have other competing worldview perspectives and all the rest. Now, if Christian, this is why you don't have to, this is why transcendental arguments does not require an inductive refutation of every possible worldview. Because if Christianity is true, then by definition, all non-Christian worldviews are false. Can we agree there? If Christianity is true, then all non-Christianities are false.
Right.
Right. So we're asking, what are the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience? What are the transcendental necessary preconditions for intelligible experience? Now, because we're dealing with necessary preconditions, there can only be one. There can only be one worldview that can provide the necessary preconditions. Otherwise, we're not talking about necessary preconditions. If there are two worldviews that both sufficiently satisfy the preconditions of intelligibility, then they're not necessary. And then you're still stuck in skepticism, since you'll have two pictures of reality equally providing a justification for knowledge. There'd be no way to actually know the true state of affairs between the particular worldview. So there has to only be one, given the fact that we're dealing with necessary preconditions. But here's the kicker with that. If there can only be one, worldview that provides the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, if Christianity is one worldview that can do it, then it follows it's the only worldview. Okay. Now the unbeliever can come along and say, well, I don't think the Christian worldview does it. Cool. That's when we interact. Okay. So when we give the transcendental argument, there's really two sides of the coin. There is the demonstration of the falsity of the non-Christian worldview by doing the internal critique. We hypothetically grant the truth of the non-Christian worldview and show that on its own terms, it's reduced to absurdity, arbitrariness, and inconsistency. Okay. And then the other side of that coin is to show that given the truth of Christianity, that which knowledge and intelligible experience requires in order to be intelligible is satisfied, given the Christian metaphysical picture, given the Christian epistemological picture and ethical picture, right? And if Christianity supplies those preconditions, then it follows it's the only worldview that can, because we're dealing with necessary preconditions. The only thing the unbeliever can attempt to do is say, I don't think Christianity does that, and here's why. But the here's why are often external critiques of the Christian worldview. They're predicated upon a foundation that is alien to the Christian worldview. Of course, you're going to show that Christianity doesn't match a view if you're assuming the opposite of Christianity from the start, which many of these people are doing when they assume atheistic principles or categories of autonomy and neutrality and things like that. The issue of neutrality is baked into a lot of these kind of critiques. When someone says, oh, I have a very simple explanation of reality, but you add something extra, you add a God thing, that assumes that their unbelieving view, their neutral view, is the default. I'm not adding anything. I'm giving you my worldview, just as you're giving me your worldview, which assumes a pretended neutrality when in fact it actually is asserting implicitly the falsehood of my view from the beginning. Right. So that's why I always highlight that no one is neutral. That's why both the atheist and the Christian, or the Muslim and the Christian, or whatever, we all are making implicit positive claims. For example, the agnostic says, I don't know if God exists. So surely the agnostic is neutral. Well, not really. Because if he says, I don't know the Christian God exists, what the agnostic is implicitly saying is that the Christian God does not exist. How is he saying this? Because when the agnostic says, I don't know if the Christian God exists, what he's saying is the God of the Bible, who reveals in Scripture that all men have a knowledge of him such that they are without excuse, he says, I don't know that God. So he's saying that when God says that he does know him, that God is wrong. Okay. Right. So to say I don't know the Christian God exists is to implicitly say the Christian God is incorrect when he says that all men have a knowledge of God. Now, to say this doesn't prove the Christian worldview, but what it highlights is that the agnostic isn't neutral. When he says, I don't know, he's actually implicitly asserting the falsehood of the Christian perspective, which teaches within its propositions in Scripture that all men do have a sufficient knowledge of the truth, but they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The unbeliever doesn't have to accept that passage that I'm referring to in Romans 1, but I pointed out to illustrate that the agnostic, just as the atheist, weak or strong atheist, whatever, they're not neutral positions. But these people just breathe the pretended neutrality. They just assume their view is the default and that we're adding to the picture.
Well, in a sense, they have their own passages, right?
Yes.
Right. We have the word of God. That's what we claim. But they have their own, and that comes in form of those types of statements. That this is the rules. I think you did a great job answering that, and I mean, I think that we all acknowledge that you even brought this up, the difference between persuasiveness. Did that persuade everyone to all of a sudden, bow the knee? No, but you gave a sufficient answer to that, and there is an idea of a totality in the concept of the impossibility of the contrary that I think is missing when a lot of people try to dissect it. And I think that you gave a really good explanation of that totality.
Just to illustrate too, this isn't like a weird thing that I'm saying as a Christian. Remember, transcendental arguments are found in secular philosophy too.
Yes.
If anyone knows anything about the history of transcendental arguments, they are by nature anti-skeptical arguments. They're meant to respond to the skeptic who is doubting something. And the transcendental argument is trying to show that there are certain things that cannot be rationally doubted, that to doubt them is to implicitly affirm them.
Yeah.
That's all I'm doing for the Christian worldview. I'm not making some weird, people don't know the history of philosophy. They don't know the history of these arguments and things like this. I'm not making some weird, unique, like Christian claim. I am in the sense that I'm arguing for Christianity, but the argument structure is standard argumentation that you can find in the history of philosophy.
And you've talked about this before, I believe, but transcendentals aren't necessarily, or the argument from transcendentals in philosophy in general isn't necessarily mainstream though, right? Is that accurate?
No, it's not. It's not mainstream. And the reason is that you have a push in the development of philosophy in the past century from what we have more continental philosophical categories to what we call analytic philosophy. So continental philosophy, which comes from the continent, Europe, the old school philosophers used to really reason in big picture categories. They're engaging in metaphysics. They're developing these huge metaphysical schemes to try to make sense of the world. But because a lot of those metaphysical schemes have failed, there was a huge kind of analytical turn where we're no longer concerned with those big metaphysical questions because it's really impossible for us to know. So we're going to focus on the small problems, the details. We're going to define our terms. We're going to have these specific arguments, talk about these localized philosophical categories over here. But that's not because transcendental arguments fail. It's because non-Christian worldviews can't answer those big questions. So they're focusing on the smaller questions, more analytic questions. But what you have in presuppositional apologetics with someone like Cornelius Van Til, and this is interesting, Van Til was a continental philosopher in the sense that he dealt with big picture, big paradigm, big worldview stuff. And this is why people get frustrated with Van Til, because in Van Til, you don't have a formulation of a specified like argument with like premises and propositions and stuff like that. But then along comes Greg Bahnsen, his prize student, who actually is an analytic philosopher. So what Bahnsen does, interestingly enough, is he takes the continental worldview emphasis of Van Til and then kind of solidifies it and melds it into a more analytic approach where you have some more specificity in, say, someone like Bahnsen. And of course, he died pretty young, so he wasn't able to develop that as deeply as we would like. But I do think that both continental focus on worldview and analytic focus on defining terms and formulating arguments, I think when married together, you get a very powerful context for doing presuppositional apologetics.
Awesome. That's great.
Just real quick. It sounds like you're saying that, stepping back just a second, it sounds like you're saying that the transcendental argument is a great way to begin a conversation, not necessarily to end a conversation. Is that when you're talking to real people in the real world? So
first, when I'm talking to real people on the street, I never use the language of transcendental arguments, preconditions of intelligibility, all the rest. Okay. Now there's a detriment here. If someone would say, can you simplify tag the transcendental argument for the existence of God in a way that you would talk to an average person? When you do that, what happens is your more sophisticated audience says, see, that's not an argument. He's just saying, see. So when we kind of generalize it, then it loses its specificity, and then you get the criticism from the people who are more philosophically astute. But then when we answer the philosophically astute people, then we get the criticism from the average person. Oh, that's just philosophical gobbledygook, right? So I want to make a distinction between the transcendental argument and reasoning according to a transcendental principle. Okay.
Okay.
When I'm arguing with the philosopher, I'm going to use the transcendental argument. I'm going to use the fancy terminology because I want to speak the language of the philosophers, right? That's what I'm connecting to. If I'm speaking to a lay person, then I'm going to argue not with an actual formalized argument. I'm going to reason and argue according to transcendental principles. So my conversation with an average person might be, hey, I'm a Christian, and Christianity helps me make sense out of the world. It helps me make sense out of why science makes sense, out of reasoning makes sense. How do you make sense out of the world without God? That's a very simple layperson approach to reasoning transcendentally. What I'm asking in a very non-sophisticated way, my worldview can provide the necessary preconditions for science. How do you make sense out of what is needed for science in a world that is sound and fury signifying nothing, to quote Shakespeare, right? And then you'll get answers like, well, science doesn't assume anything. It just describes the chaos, and when we say describe assumes the opposite of chaos, because to describe something means you have to think in an orderly way, and order and chaos are diametric opposites, but we won't go there.
Very good. All right. So I want to set up this
Sorry
question.
for being condescending. I get when I do an impression of like an opponent just for illustrative purposes. I'm not saying unbelievers sound like that. They're very intelligent unbelievers, but I just do it for teaching purposes. So I do apologize.
I do have to set this next one up with a story. I'm pretty sure you've heard this, kind of joke or anecdote about Satan challenging God, right? And he comes and he says, "Hey, I want to challenge you to see who can create the best universe," right? And God, acquiesces to this, and Satan goes down to pick up dirt and rock to form it, and God says, "Get your own." And I thought that really fit into this next comment that we had. It said that AI is completely capable of logic and reasoning, and God didn't create it. It's purely materialistic, made of silicone and various metals, chemicals, and plastics. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that analogy.
Well, I mean,
and that statement.
That's a silly analogy, a very naive analogy, and it misses an obvious point. Human beings who use logic and rationality invented AI. And then we're right back to the question, well, how do human beings account for the reason and the logic they use to actually make AI? So you're still going to get back to the fundamental question. So that's a very odd analogy. It's almost like you didn't think about that when you gave that analogy. It seems like an obvious point, right?
It's God saying,
like if you
make your own dirt.
Right. So
the principles have been created to do that, and that's what the debate actually is about.
Right. If someone says, I don't need God, we don't need God for life. We created life in a lab. We don't need intelligence. It's like, well, wait a minute. It's the intelligence that set up the conditions for the experiment. I mean, this is the difference. People who focus on science and have no philosophical training or no philosophical self-consciousness, they don't realize you don't see how that doesn't work. I mean, it's very odd that
I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on this, because I think it's obvious, but maybe you can explain it in a way that may be more persuasive. But the person actually had said in further conversation that basically philosophy has contributed nothing to basically humanity. And I was like, wow, like I guess, and I feel like you would be better off answering that than me. So, I mean, what would you say to someone who said philosophy doesn't contribute anything to humanity?
I'm not really, again, the fact that this person just said that is expressing their own philosophical perspective. So if anything, philosophy has given us the freedom to express our views, which just is philosophical, right? Someone says, oh, philosophy's stupid. I don't think we should use philosophy. Well, that's a nice philosophy. Your philosophy of philosophy is that we shouldn't use philosophy. I mean, people don't see how kind of self-referentially absurd a lot of these lines of reasoning, even science. I mean, you have the philosophy of science.
Right.
If you like science, then the philosophy of science actually undergirds science. So you can't do science without a philosophy of science, because philosophy precedes the doing of the activity. You got to think about the things and have an outlook and all the rest. Unless this person assumes you kind of just start like with a blank slate, that's a very naive philosophical position. It's got its own problems. So these are very naive ways of approaching, I think, really important philosophical issues. And I don't think it pays due respect to the importance of some of these ideas that really they really provide the foundation for all these things they take for granted.
Yeah. No, I think we made him cranky tonight. I think we brought him the questions that really made him
I'm
cranky.
not that cranky. I didn't have my coffee. That's why I'm
Oh, that's what it is.
I figured when I'm nice, people think I'm a jerk. And then when I mean, people say I'm a jerk. So I might as well just be myself and just be cranky when I feel cranky.
Hey, Eli, the bottom line is you're our jerk. So it doesn't matter.
That's good enough for me.
Hey, thank you so much for being on the show, Eli. I'm Kelvin. This is Josiah. You've been watching Cloud and Fire by Kelvin's Faith Unfiltered. And until next time, stay shaped by reason, guided by faith, and grounded in Christ. Take it easy.
What was groundbreaking in